Passenger cars and motorcycles, as well as parts for both, account for most of Indian vehicle exports to the African continent. Motorcycles have become indispensable components of urban and rural transport across some of Africa's fast-growing and still poorly connected economies. Two-wheeler exports registered a growth of 7.3% in the financial year 2019 and 2020. The major export markets of the made-in-India two-wheelers are African and Latin American countries, the biggest African markets being Nigeria, Angola and Uganda. Indian motorcycle exports have increased by 175% to Africa since 2008, with the most pronounced ascent in Egypt, 850%, Rwanda 870%, and Sierra Leone and Djibouti both over 1,000%. According to Standard Bank's research, Indian-based Bajaj Auto, the world's fourth largest manufacturer of motorcycles and auto rickshaws, export to 35 African countries. Frost & Sullivan's recent analysis, Global Electric Vehicle Market Outlook 2020, as the market recovers after COVID-19, it is predicted to experience healthy growth. An optimistic scenario, electric vehicles are estimated to grow to 2.5 million unit sales, including battery electric vehicles plus plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, globally in 2020. Sulaja Firodia Motwani, Vice Chairperson, Kinetic Engineering and Founder and CEO, Kinetic Green Energy and Power Solutions Limited. Michael Mabasa, CEO, NAMSA, National Association of Automobile Manufacturers of South Africa. Yannico Dunhauser, Product and Pricing Manager, Jaguar Land Rover South Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. The moderator is CNBC Africa anchor Fifi Peters.
Good afternoon to you all, and of course, thank you so much for joining the Indo-Africa Summit for 2021. Let's get straight to this discussion, and Michael, I'd like to begin with you. The car market, automotive market, has traditionally played quite an important role in keeping the wheels of the South African economy turning, and it's most likely to play an even bigger role in assisting our recovery from COVID-19. How would you describe that current state of recovery and the role that electrification will play in driving us forward?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much for having me, Fifi. Good to see you, and to my panelists as well. Absolutely. So South Africa has gone through some very challenging time. 2020 was a very difficult year for us. We've seen some stages, very challenging stages of lockdown restrictions in the country, which impacted mainly on the four key performance indicators that we chase. And we look at every month. So we look at, because South Africa is a vehicle producing country, we produce vehicles in South Africa. We are actually the 22nd biggest producer of vehicles globally. That has obviously had a major implications for us in terms of the vehicles that we're producing. And we've also become a very huge export market, as South Africa, because 64% of what we are producing in South Africa is actually sold out of the country as exports. And naturally, because of COVID-19, we've seen a very huge decline of about 30% in terms of our export volumes in 2020. And naturally, obviously, this has had a major implication, for the industry as a whole. The second key performance indicator that we look at is obviously imports, because we bring in, imports into the country from different countries, such as India, because we do have a number of Indian brands in the market. And unfortunately, those brands did not come as big as we had expected, primarily because of the fact that a number of markets obviously had their own lockdown restrictions, and the value chain was naturally impacted upon, particularly also our supply chain in terms of making sure that we are able to bring those vehicles into the country. That obviously had a huge impact on us. And then the third KPI that we look at is obviously new vehicle sales in the country, which has also gone down by 29% in 2020, which is very, very huge for us. And to put that number into perspective, we've seen the levels that we've seen in 2020 pretty much 20 years ago. So we've retrogressed as South Africa 20 years back, and the levels that we've seen in 2020 are the ones that we actually recorded around the year 2000. So we've got a lot of catching up to do, and we are very excited, obviously, about the possibility of the electromobility, because for us, it's not just about electric vehicles only. We're looking at electromobility as a much bigger conversation so that we can really be able to make sure that we are not talking just about electric vehicles. We're also talking about connected vehicles that can be able to talk to one another on the road. We're also talking about autonomous driving and also, shared mobility, because people are moving very, gradually from using and buying vehicles for their own, consumption, but obviously getting into a lot of shared mobility. So there's been some very interesting trends that we've seen in 2020 that I think will give us a very good perspective as we go forward into 2021.
Right. Sulaja, perhaps come in here and give us the Indian perspective. I mean, as we talk about how much catching up South Africa's car market has to do, what is the state of play in India right now as we do prepare to wrap up the first quarter of 2021? How much catching up do you have to do, and also the role that electrification will play in that catch-up? Could you just unmute for us? I really look forward to the days when just by virtue of you talking, the unmute button is done for you automatically, but we're not quite there yet.
Well, hi, I'm happy to be here on this talk with all of you, and congratulations to IMC for hosting this seminar. As you rightly said, last year has been a difficult year for the entire automobile industry. But we are certainly seeing a demand uptake in India across all the sectors of automotive sector. And we expect that this year, 2021, will be a better year, given that there is the COVID vaccine around the corner. And overall, there is an improvement in the consumer index, confidence index. Coming to electric vehicles, I think you must have been seeing that India has been very committed to electrification of the transportation sector. India is one of the largest automobile markets in the world. And the government here has decided that the route for electrification in India is not going to be through cars. So it is not going to be the Teslas, which is going to fire up the India's electrification story, but it is going to be green mobility for the masses. So the focus is going to be on electrification of the two-wheeler sector and the three-wheeler sector, as well as public transport like buses. The government here is very keen that India takes a lead on electrification of their two-wheeler, three-wheeler and buses, brings the benefits of electric vehicles to the common man. We know that electric vehicles are much cheaper to run, 40 paisa a kilometer vis-a-vis 4 rupees for diesel vehicles. So there's a big savings. The fuel prices here have gone through the roof. Petrol is costing 100 rupees a litre. So I think people are very interested to look at how quickly they can transition to electric vehicles. And I think that in the coming decade, India will see a rapid move towards electrification, especially for two-wheelers and three-wheelers, also supported by the falling battery prices. Along with the electric vehicles, the auto component industry is looking at investing in this sector to make the parts locally. There are charging companies which are setting up shop here to provide the charging infrastructure. So I believe that the entire ecosystem will get fueled in this decade, and it will create new jobs. It will create new technologies in the area of course, electric vehicles, their components, the charging infrastructure, batteries, battery cells maybe also, and also services like the fleet aggregation, IoT, software. So many new opportunities will come about. And I think all this will be fueled by the fact that the battery prices are coming down. So electric vehicles will become cheaper, not only greener, but cheaper alternative for people. And hopefully this will really go a long way in reducing pollution in India, which is a big cause of concern.
Yeah.
So I believe that the coming decade will be the decade of rapid electrification of India's transport sector.
You're right. Yeah, and price has traditionally been one of the deterrents to increased uptake in more electric cars. And Janiko, if we can just get an opening remark from you, as you are one of the players in South Africa currently that does produce an electric car in the form of your Jaguar I-Pace. Just describe to us what demand has been like, uptake for the car has been like, which is in the higher end or higher segment of the market presently.
So thank you for having me. Overall, the electric car industry in South Africa is still in its infancy, where we're making up less than 1% of the total sales, as Mike mentioned earlier. So it is still a new technology. It is, and there's limited players in the market. But most of the vehicles sourced from South Africa and the rest of Africa are largely sourced out of markets that are rapidly adopting EV as a mainstream and have announced very definite stages of moving from ICE or internal combustion engines to plug-in hybrids and full electric. So it's essential that we follow that trend, that global trend, because we might be left behind. We might not have vehicles to sell in Africa. We've also seen that there's African countries, for example, Mauritius, that's been very successful in introducing EV. Some of our product lines have grown by 10% or 10 times over, just with the introduction of very progressive duty rates and structures on EV and plug-in hybrids. So there is definitely a market for EV vehicles currently with the correct duty and support, but also looking to the future, that will be the option that's available to us. And we can't imagine that Africa and the rest of the world won't follow these global trends.
Mm-hmm. And I suppose the argument can be made that we won't have a choice but to follow these global trends. Mikhail, you gave us the statistic in your opening remark regarding just how big our export market was. 64% of the cars made locally here are for exports. And they're made in markets that are speeding up regulation towards lower carbon emission cars. I believe that in the UK, by 2030, cars as we know them today will be banned. And also in China, by 2035 or so, half of the cars in that market will be hybrid combustible engines, the other half electric. So South Africa can't afford to fall behind, particularly if regulation bans the cars that we're currently making from entering our main markets. So my question to you then is, how is the industry aligning for this future to protect current market share?
Well, absolutely. I think these are some of the conversations we're currently having with government and also with other stakeholders, so that we can really be able to make sure that we accelerate the adoption of electric vehicles in South Africa. And as I indicated earlier on, for us, it's a very big deal because we produce vehicles that are going into Europe in the main. I mean, 3 out of every vehicle that we export out of South Africa goes into Europe. And many European countries have already given us notice. So we know for a fact that in the next 9 to 15 years, those vehicles will not be going into those markets, which will obviously have a massive implication for our production capacity. And also remember that South Africa has developed what we call the Automotive Master Plan, where we really want to double our current production capacity by the year 2035. And there's no way that we will obviously be able to reach those levels if we do not, quickly, create a fertile regulatory environment so that we can really be able to make sure that South Africa has the capacity to, to move with the trends. So we are working very closely with government. In fact, this week, Thursday, we are meeting with the Minister of Trade, Industry and Competition here in South Africa so that we can be able to debate some of the important regulatory reforms that we need in order to be able to provide some certainty. Because, as you know, a lot of global companies are, multinational corporations. And in order for them to be able to make investment decisions, they need some regulatory certainty. And we need to be able to be very clear about where the country is moving and what our position is on electric vehicles. So South Africa is definitely, forced, unfortunately, to conform and to work very hard to make sure that we introduce these measures sooner rather than later.
I mean, perhaps the kind of regulatory uncertainty that we are seeing coming out of India by way of the support that country is giving to electric and also green mobility. And Sulaj, as you spoke about the plans for the two-wheelers and the three-wheelers and the buses there in India to ramp up production a lot more in terms of cleaner and greener vehicles, I'm interested in your plans for the continent. I mean, how many of those vehicles do you see finding a home here in Africa? Traditionally, it has been quite a strong demand pipeline from the continent. What are your forecasts for the current production line?
Well, as you rightly said, Indian automobiles, especially motorcycles and also the rickshaws or three-wheelers, are very popular across Africa. And Indian brands enjoy great respect. They're seen as good quality vehicles, and certainly therefore, there are many opportunities for collaboration also on the electric vehicle front. Incidentally, even for Africa, I believe that the route to electrification should be by using electric motorcycles and electric rickshaws rather than electric cars. Also because most of the cars in Africa are imported. So it's difficult to have used and imported. So it's difficult to have electric used and imported cars. And also because there's no charging infrastructure available across the continent. So it would be easier to first bring electric motorcycles, scooters, and rickshaws, which are used mostly within the cities. And Africa, of course, is getting highly urbanized rapidly. So in pockets where there's good electrification, I think electric two-wheelers and three-wheelers should be deployed. And I think Indian companies and also Indian government and African government can collaborate to create such opportunities. We would have to consciously work towards this. Today, there is no policy framework in place for electric vehicles in Africa, whether it's import duties, which tend to be higher than fossil fuel vehicles, whether it's regulation for registration, which is non-existent, whether it's subsidies, which are required to make electric vehicles more attractive, which are currently not available. So I think we should work together. And certain countries like Nigeria, Uganda, Angola, where Indian vehicles are popular, we can certainly introduce do some pilot projects to bring motorcycle taxis, to create livelihood programs using electric vehicles for delivery or for waste management, or for vending articles like vegetables and other daily articles, so that people get exposed to electric vehicles. And then slowly the awareness and acceptance will build, ecosystem will build. And I'm sure in the long run, maybe I'm looking at a few years down the line, that the demand for electric vehicles would rise. But I think it would have to be a conscious effort to look at policies, to look at livelihood or other programs, look at duty structures, and create some examples to demonstrate the benefits of electric vehicles, for which the governments should work together.
Janiko, just to come back to the issue of price that was raised, and also what we have seen with the iPace, because we have all seen the influencer campaign that Jaguar has used with some of the prominent, influential young South Africans who are driving your cars. And there's one that comes to mind whereby the car is parked in the garage, and a certain lady just takes out her charging station and she plugs it into the wall. So just, is that where it ends by way of charging station? Is it something that will be limited to an individual's home? Or for Jaguar to also ramp up its presence in the electric car market, would we need perhaps a mass rollout of charging stations across the country nationally? If you could just talk to me about the dynamics there.
So Jaguar Land Rover has already invested 60 million rand in infrastructure across South Africa, so electrifying the N1, driving to Cape Town, driving to Durban, driving to certain areas up north. So we've already invested heavily in infrastructure. We still believe that the main source and main points and most effective and cheapest way of charging would be at home. A lot of that is driven by customer behavior. Electric vehicles are closer to a cell phone, actually, when it comes to usage. By charging overnight, charging when electricity rates are actually lower, the most effective charging would be at home. So at night when you get home and you charge your vehicle, you wake up with a fully charged vehicle. In the case of iPace, it's over 400 kilometers of range. So home charging, we think, will remain the main point of charging. However, infrastructure will assist in longer trips and long distance driving.
Okay. But I suppose that's if you've got electricity at home to begin with, to charge your car. The power shortages in Africa are very well known, and very well known for the deterrent that they are in terms of, further investments in the space. So Michael, just talk to me around the industry's thinking around power security. I mean, are we seeing a saving grace in the fact that we are accelerating our push to get a lot more renewables into our energy mix? Or is that perhaps still a long way away to giving us the power security we need right now?
Well, absolutely. So we are very encouraged. I mean, the news that were announced last week by the Minister of Energy, Minister Mantashe, when he announced, for an example, the 8 independent power producers that are going to be working with government in order to produce additional, capacity to be able to augment the national grid. I think that's definitely the way to go, because certainly we know that Eskom has been battling with load shedding, and the last thing we want, is to have a situation where the rollout of electric vehicles in South Africa is fast-tracked, but we do not have the capacity to be able to make sure that we charge these vehicles. I mean, as Jenico said, the preference will certainly be at home, but if our homes do not have electricity, we'll still have a challenge in terms of making sure that we are able to power these vehicles accordingly. So, and then I think one of the challenges that we have in South Africa is the vast, country that we have. In order for a person to travel from Palabora, which is up north, up until Cape Town, you need at least about 3, maybe 4 charges along that main road on the N1 to be able to get to Cape Town. And we need to be able to give people that level of comfort that they can be able to get onto those long journeys, particularly as we're going into Easter in the next week or so. People can be able to comfortably get onto their electric vehicles and do those long, trips. And I think it has been a very major challenge as well in terms of adoption, because a lot of people are very skeptical whether will we have enough infrastructure capability in order for us to be able to make sure that we are able to charge vehicles. And I think we're also, working very closely with the private sector as well, so that we can be able to make sure that private sector companies, we're having very interesting conversations now with our oil companies, for example, that are currently providing, fuel, to say to what extent can they also play a role in terms of deploying charging stations in their current infrastructure. Because already there's an infrastructure already that is existing. All you need to do is obviously to deploy those charging stations in that existing infrastructure instead of building new white elephant infrastructure that no one will be able to use in the future. So we're looking at different ways to make sure that we are able to make sure that South Africa is able to make sure that the rollout of infrastructure is solid and it's able to cover the length and breadth of the country, because we also want rural areas as well to be able to adopt electric vehicles, because we don't want these electric vehicles to only be in our major cities. We also want rural areas, our townships, to also have infrastructure that people can be able to depend on.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, you're talking about white infrastructure, and just thinking that it's something that we can ill afford to waste money on any form of building or any form of infrastructure out there that we don't end up using. But Solaja, just coming back to your point regarding unlocking the investment bottlenecks in this space. So what we did witness throughout the COVID-19 lockdown pandemics was the disruption to supply chains that a lot of manufacturers experienced as a result of things being locked down. And as a result, as we're talking about building back better, a lot of economies are trying to position or strengthen their localization strategies to, prevent that kind of disturbance in the event of the next crisis. I'm just interested in the plans that your company has for perhaps ramping up its manufacturing facilities, or even entering more manufacturing here on the continent. As many countries talk about increasing localization and the benefits that it can accrue for both the foreign country and also the incumbent where you plan to set up. What's your localization strategy for Africa?
So certainly, as far as the Indian market goes, we are extremely focused on localization. In fact, has almost 100% of its supply chain localized, even for its electric vehicles. And we have been working really hard to develop the components, to work with the local suppliers here to ramp that up. And that's also in line with the vision of the Indian government to have localized the EV technology. Now, when it comes to the localization strategy for the African continent, I do believe, and I'm convinced that electric vehicles is the future of automotive technology. And in fact, the coming decade will set pace to accelerate the EV deployment. And probably by 2040, a large part of the global transportation sector will be electric. And maybe by 2050, only a few percentage of special vehicles may be using, fossil fuels. So the world is moving to electric. And I think, therefore, Africa, which also has a climate change problem, which is also developing, whether it's urbanization, electrification, availability of electricity, I think certainly will increase its deployment of electric vehicles. So this is inevitable. So as the market develops, as more electric vehicles are demanded in Africa, as it becomes a large market for electric vehicles, certainly manufacturers like us would like to come and be closer to the market. Today is still very nascent. We need to work hard to create the initial population and ecosystem for electric vehicles, the right policies, the right framework to attract electric vehicles. But in the long run, once we create a few million vehicles in the market, certainly it will accelerate demand. And I think manufacturers would then like to come and be closer to your markets and make vehicles required specifically by the African customers with the right features, with the right value proposition. So I think we've just begun the journey. The journey is certainly in the direction of electric vehicles, but there's a long way to go. And I do hope that the Indian and African companies and governments will collaborate to create the right ecosystem and policy framework right now to pave way for this great future ahead.
Yeah, I agree, and I hope for the same, because ultimately a collaboration like that will be a spin-off for both economies and more critically jobs. But Janiko, can you just drive us through your forecasts as you see the EV market unwinding? Or you dropped that statistic at the beginning of the conversation that currently I believe is at less than 1% or so of cars in South Africa or perhaps Africa are EVs. So talk to us about Jaguar's plan for the future. Solaja spoke about the fact that she's expecting the adoption of EVs to accelerate rapidly within the next 10 years. What are your forecasts? And perhaps if you just add to that the major risks to realizing those targets?
So Jaguar Land Rover is committed to electric future. Jaguar will be fully electric by 2025, and Land Rover will welcome 6 new pure electric vehicles in the next 5 years, with the ultimate goal of being net zero carbon business by 2039. So from a Jaguar Land Rover point of view, that is the direction of our business. That's where we're going. To speculate on the rate of adoption, that's a very difficult question. I can only comment from Jaguar Land Rover's position is that it is a definite direction of our business to introduce electric vehicles and increase the availability of electric vehicles over the next 5 years and going further. So projections can be anywhere between 15 and 30%, but there is a number of variables in this mix that could change that. Everything from infrastructure to support by government when it comes to duties. What we need is to see more automotive manufacturers entering the market. In South Africa, we've had commitment of more manufacturers actually entering the market in the very near future. So we believe we need a thriving industry to get EV to mass adoption. So the quicker we can get more manufacturers to bring vehicles to South Africa and Africa, the quicker that adoption rate will be.
All right. And just finally, Michael, your closing thoughts. I mean, as you prepare for your much important meeting with the minister later this week regarding the plans for the car market. I mean, we've already heard the fact that we as a continent don't actually have an electric or electrification policy to begin with, that import duties are a lot higher on electric cars than there are on, you know, the more harmful fossil fuel cars, as it were, and that we are lacking in subsidies and tax incentives to get investments into the sector flowing. So closing comments and also a response to how you're likely to put these issues to the minister when you do meet.
Well, look, I think our message is very clear that the time to, for procrastination, has come and gone. We need to now firm up and make decisions that are firm, not only in the interest of South Africa, but certainly in the interest of the entire continent. Because remember, we are now a member of a regional, a continental bloc since the beginning of January this year, after the signing of the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. And we really want to work with all other sister countries across the continent so that we can really accelerate not just only the adoption of electric vehicles into the continent, but certainly to make sure that Africa is able to take its place in terms of making sure that we're able to contribute meaningfully towards the growth and the development of the automotive sector globally, because we've been left behind and we've really not been very active. We've got some amazing opportunities, particularly in terms of localization, because a lot of products that we have that goes into many of our manufacturing process are actually endowed and coming from Africa as a whole. So we really need to be able to create a very stable regulatory environment in South Africa and across the continent so that we can really be able to play as aggressively as we have ever done before globally, because a lot of these multinational companies depend on Africa in terms of sourcing of their raw materials. And we need to be able to sit firmly on that main table so that we can really be able to firm up and say, this is the contribution that we are making. If you look at the battery packs, for an example, and the battery manufacturing, a lot of the raw materials for those batteries are coming out of Africa. And we need to be able to set the tone differently so that we can really be able to make sure that we take this industry towards a different direction. And I think in the next couple of years, we need to be able to step up as a continent.
Exactly. Michael, thank you so much for those closing remarks, and nothing further to add there, but just to say, 100% in agreement with what you and the rest of the panelists have shared. What is quite interesting is the fact that, you can actually see a lot of support from the investment community into these industries of the future. You just take the growth of Tesla in such a short space of time as a prime example. In fact, right now, that company is sitting at a higher market capitalization than Ford, GM, and Fiat Chrysler combined, and showing the fact that there will be support and there can be financial support towards these investments if of course we do have that policy framework to ensure that those investments will be kept safe. But thanks so much to the panel, and have yourselves a great afternoon. And with that note, I hand it back to Zinati, who has been doing a fantastic job at day one of the Indo-Africa Summit as your MC. Zinati, it's back to you to do your thing.
Yep, thank you very much, Fifi. It is indeed very encouraging that the private automotive sector will be meeting with the South African government as early as Thursday. Of course, we do know that we do need to cultivate a fertile regulatory environment for those investments to come in terms of the electrification of the transport system in South Africa. And what was interesting for me is the comments that were made that we do need to bring those electric vehicles to the common man, to the townships, and to rural areas.